Two reports that are coming out from my office today. I want to thank our staff. This has been an ongoing project on a couple of levels, but we're going to walk you through. So at any point, if you do have questions you want to ask as we go through it, these reports will be on our website, osa.ms.gov, this afternoon. This is in response to the Department of Peer. The Legislative Joint Office of the Peer Committee released their report on Monday, and part of that report was recommending that the auditor's office take our action and look into some of the contracting and purchasing habits and behaviors at the State Department of Education. We've been in that process over the last year or longer, and so we felt like it was time to go ahead and put that forward involved. So we'll walk you through kind of where we are as we deal with this. To remind you, Code Section 77211 is what authorizes the State Auditor's Office to conduct any of our audits and investigations at any time. That's where this compliance audit that was conducted last year, completed this year, falls under, as well as the work we did on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Inspector General. It's also where our normal annual, comprehensive annual financial report audit and audit for the single audit takes place. We have 5 specific findings in the compliance audit dealing with the Department of Education. The first of those is that oversight by the Board of Education, the State Board of Education, should be strengthened. We saw a lack of oversight that potentially can lead to fraud, waste, and abuse, as well as it's imperative for the Board of Education to have oversight of necessary accountability to ensure that funding is effectively reaching the classroom. As with all boards and commissions in Mississippi, the ultimate buck stops at the board or the commission. And that's no different for the State Department of Education and the Board of Education. They are the entity that enters into or authorizes the department to enter into contracts and authorizes those invoices to be paid. Ultimately, that's where that burden stops, and there's a need for greater oversight and greater controls by the State Board of Education. The second finding that you'll find in the compliance audit has to do with ensuring that compliance to state laws and strengthen internal controls. And this is the really meat of our compliance report and the biggest issues that we're concerned with. That they should adopt procurement policies, or have in the past adopted policies that circumvent state law and do not require approval by the State Personal Services Contract Review Board. And we'll unwrap this as we go. So there's, like I said, I know we got microphones here to try to speak clearly, but as we talk about, this is the biggest issue. They had blatant disregard at the Department of Education for the procurement regulations. State statute sets up that the Department of Finance and Administration, specifically through the Personal Services Contract Review Board, establishes all of the rules and regs that we follow when it comes to state purchasing and when bids take place, our contracting and competitive bidding takes place. The Department of Education established their own process and their own rules, and that leads to issues we've got to deal with. Back at the time of these contracts, the amounts were $100,000. That now has even been ratcheted down to $75,000. The state is really trying to address this issue, the potential fraud, especially as it comes in dealing with agencies, as we've dealt with in the past, like Department of Corrections, where we've had violations of purchasing and issues. This is something the legislature and the state government has been addressing and will continue to do so. To remind you, the State Personnel Services Contract Review Board requires personal service contracts exceeding, at that time, $100,000 to be competitively bid and to go through that board for approval. Agencies, including Department of Education, have to adopt operational procedures for contracts exceeding $50,000. This is language specifically from that Personal Services Contract Review Board, that procurements requirements shall neither be artificially divided to avoid using other methods of bid selection, nor shall the extent of the services required be underestimated so as to constitute a small purchase. Generally, there should be only one contract within an agency per vendor for a particular type of service. That's language verbatim from the Personnel Services Review Board. Department of Education created what they call a pool method. The pool method was not approved by the State Personnel Board or the Personal Services Contract Review Board, or at least no one has been able to provide documentation of this approval at any level. So therefore, we have to assume, and all the facts point to the fact, that the pool method at the Department of Education was outside the bounds of state law. It allowed contractors to avoid being subject to a competitive bid process. And in the process, we discovered that several of these vendors were awarded multiple contracts in the same year. I'll give you a couple of examples as we walk this through. In IT grants for IT governance scope of services, you had Elton Stokes receiving a contract in 15, but at the same time Blue Sky. When you pull those contracts, while they have separate contract numbers, the subject line is all the same. It appears to be very much identical work being done at the same period of time out of those same pools. Data One IT in 16 picks up another contract for $48,000. That company is owned by Elton Stokes and his wife. This kind of optic would not be possible if it went through the Personnel Services Contract Review Board and the normal standard operating procedures. The other issue is where we have grants for oversight of MIS OTSS divisions, or basically the same group and same division. You see one company, Blue Sky Innovations, with 3 separate contracts overlapping each other throughout the process. Again, when you pull those contracts, the basis appears to be exactly the same work being done for the same amount. Contracts all coming up against that $100,000 limit during that time and overlapping each other. So again, it does definitely appear to be contract splitting, avoiding our state procurement laws. Finding 3. The next couple of findings are going to be very common that we see elsewhere in state government, that the Department of Education should strengthen their internal controls over bank accounts and cash receipts to ensure compliance. Basically, when we go in to do an audit, and have gone in and done an audit, they could not provide us authorization letters by DFA for bank accounts that were open in the name of the Department of Education. We're only allowed to have bank accounts that have been authorized by the state, therefore you have accountability and transparency. That's not always the case. Even for FY15, Department of Education still could not give us 100% of their bank accounts when requested, or their CPA firm went in to do their audit. This continues to be an accountability problem that the State Board of Education has got to get better internal controls on when it comes to the financial management Department of Education. Ensuring purchases are properly documented and paid in a timely manner. We did find that they could not provide us where the proper authorizations or any supporting documentation of the deliverables of purchases were made for services and or purchases by specific vendors. I can't go into this any further because as we finish an audit, it does become an investigative issue, and if state law has been broken here, that becomes an issue of law enforcement that we will be dealing with in the future. Our last finding when it comes to the compliance audit, the Department of Education needs to strengthen their internal controls over those bank accounts and cash receipts. They could not properly, and this is a personnel matter, account for leave, major medical, compensatory leave. That's not unusual. We do find that, and that's one of the issues dealing with larger state agencies that we find. That one was not as concerning to us as the previous issues that we pointed out, especially the second finding on the list. The second report that's being issued today is our forensic audit that we conducted on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General. As the findings and the issues were laid out when it comes to management of federal grants, the Department of Education themselves discovered that $7.6 million plus had been misspent between Title I and 21st century federal grant programs. They did take corrective actions internally, but that also was in the middle of us doing our compliance audit, delaying that compliance audit to be completed so that we could shift gears and go to work on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General to do a forensic audit of those federal programs. Biggest issue is when federal grants are misused, they have to be repaid. We are a poor state and cannot afford to be paid back. I addressed this issue earlier this year at the Neshoba County Fair when I called on the legislature and the governor's office to create an office of federal contract oversight and management to help our state agencies comply with all the rules, regulations, to provide any training, to make sure that we can help our state be good, accountable stewards of federal dollars that do come to our state so we don't get in a situation where we have to pay back. We've had other state agencies, Department of Public Safety, that's had to pay back money, MEMA, Medicaid, and now Department of Education has had to go back and correct their management of federal dollars. August of 16, they announced that it faced a deficit in grant funding for 21st century programs. They overspent it because of lack of controls of those funds. It turns out they had used 21st century grant funds were used to pay for after-school care. That's what 21st century funds from MDE to pay for after-school care for Mississippi students. It had been depleted and internally had gone to Title I grant funds were used to pay 21st century funds. Title I is a flow-through money that comes grant that goes through the Department of Education to our local school districts to help offset instructional costs. Actual money was taken away from our local school districts, our students in Mississippi, to cover after-school costs during that time period, actually ranking over 2 fiscal years. U.S. Department of Education, Office of Inspector General asked that we go in on their behalf to help identify and determine the amount of misused funds, the problems and corrective actions that can be taken. Again, we got into a conference with Department of Education and the other entities, and we have now gone and completed that work. This report has been submitted to the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Inspector General. MDA did indicate you're looking at 19 to 21 million of misappropriated funds. They did take corrective action. They found of the initial misappropriation, approximately 11.7 million of 21st century funds. We discovered 150,000 of that was returned to MDE from overpaid school districts. So that was part of the corrective action. In 15, misappropriation was approximately $7.6 million and another $4 million in FY16. Department of Education took corrective action and corrected the error for 16, and in 17, $7.6 million had to be appropriated additionally by the state legislature in order to help correct this problem and this financial gap. We are a poor state. We cannot afford to be paying back money, especially when it comes to money that we need to give to the districts to fund our classrooms, our teachers, and Mississippi students. Specifically, how did this happen? Department of Education personnel miscalculated how much money was available in the 21st Century Fund. It was poor management, lack of understanding of our statewide accounting system that caused this program to fail to realize what their actual balance was and to overspend that program. When that was found out, these personnel knowingly and intentionally colluded to circumvent existing controls and conceal the calculation. I want to be real clear on this. Department of Education has released those 3 individuals that were involved in this. They took corrective actions to address this issue at the Department of Education. Department of Education rectified those questions in 15-16 related to those funds. The total amount of that corrections and accounting was $11.7 million. And those errors, some school districts and some school community learning centers actually were not able to provide programming and actually had to lay off staff during that time. Those are the big nuggets that are in these 2 reports that are being released today. Somebody asked earlier today why we were releasing the reports this afternoon. Very simple. The Legislative Peer Committee released their reports on Monday. This is an issue that's important for our policymakers in Mississippi, the public to know what's going on, and the Board of Education to take the corrective action and get the controls in place that are expected of them by the taxpayers of the state of Mississippi. I'm glad to answer any questions. I want to thank my staff for all of your hard work, but this job's not over. We will continue our job at the auditor's office, not just from an audit standpoint, but from an investigative standpoint as well. Jeff?
You mentioned invoice splitting, being against PSCRB rules or whatever. Isn't that also Mississippi Code, Title 37, a criminal violation?
It is, and as I said, we don't, as you know, I've been doing this for 10 years, we don't comment on ongoing investigations.
The beneficiaries of these contracts, what are the relationships between them and MDE?
A lot of these individuals had prior relationships with the current superintendent of education, Dr. Wright, and relationships. Now, while there's nothing illegal about those relationships in place, but it does get very squirrely and questions are raised that we do want to get to the bottom of. You have husband and wives, both in some of those pools we mentioned earlier, as well as the company they jointly own together. Another individual by name, and then his own company listed. So what would appear on paper to be 5 different entities, at the end of the day, really winds up being 2. So there's a lot of crossbreeding and pollination in these individuals, these contracts, and we'll be digging into that as we move forward.
MDE said y'all's office also requested contracts with Cavion and Questar. What was the reason for that?
We don't comment on ongoing investigations. That's a good question, but we are looking into numerous contracts and invoice payments out of the Department of Education, specifically what the board has authorized.
What can you tell us, you mentioned in Peer Did as well, what can you tell us about Joseph B. Kyle's or Kyle's Company or Kyle's Group purchases?
The peer committee's report speaks specifically to the list of entities that you just mentioned. It goes from an individual to a corporation. Corporation dissolved during these times, and contracts are with them. He, along with other vendors, we will be looking into their contracts, what those were structured, whether they were split contracts, whether for the same services. As I showed you on the slide, we have one company had overlapping contracts for what appear the same exact services, and this is not that complicated, were they or were they not. This is a yes or no answer that can be answered. They're going to have to answer for those, but also what was the deliverables and where did the money go and what was delivered to the Department of Education and or school districts in Mississippi. And if nothing's been proven, the law of Mississippi authorizes our office to issue demands to recover those funds. And I've been very clear, not just when it comes to education, but if one red cent that was appropriated or received intended for the school children of Mississippi or the classroom teachers has been misappropriated, we'll use the full extent of the laws of the state to recover that money.
Do you know anything about Kyle's or the Kyle's Company? I mean, are you satisfied that they were a legitimate vendor?
No.
No, you don't know, or no, you're not satisfied?
No, I'm not satisfied. And I think that's as far as I'm going to go with that.
Suppose it's determined that there was an intention to evade contract review board, procurement laws, et cetera. What are the possible remedies?
Well, state law again authorizes us to issue demands to recoup any funds that were misappropriated and misspent.
That'd be from the agency, the employees, or
Ultimately, at
the
the end of
beneficiaries?
at the end of the day, that goes to the Board of Education. They're the ones that authorize contracts. The Board of Education authorizes paying of invoices or authorizes employees to enter into those contracts. At the end of the day, the buck stops at the boards and commissions in Mississippi.
Are they bonded?
I do believe that they are bonded. I think they're required under state law to be so.
Have you been in contact with other law enforcement, federal or state?
You know, we don't discuss those relationships or ongoing actions. Do you have a question?
I feel like you're not going to be able to answer it. You mentioned that you would use the full extent of the law, and I just want to know what that might mean.
Well, obviously, we always issue demands. We do work with our partners across the board, I'm speaking generically, to bring whatever means and whatever leverage we can to make the taxpayers whole when there's been misappropriation. That's been I've been doing this as your auditor now for 8 years, over 8 years. We're going on 10 years now. And so we try to make sure that we use every leverage we can to make the taxpayers whole, to protect the taxpayers' interest, and this case will be no different than any other case. Jeff?
You said repeatedly when you were discussing the 21st century program and Title I money that the Department of Education took corrective action. That made it sound like, or that you could interpret it as that once the higher-ups found out what was going on, that they put a stop to it. Do they still face liability for those sorts of things?
Correct. As far as the federal grant programs, once the money has been repaid and restored from the 21st century program back, I think this year, into the Title I program, at that point, and part of this report that has been submitted back to the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General, they will make that determination. Are they satisfied? Again, we were working on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education Office of Inspector General on that issue. I think most of the corrective action, but they need to strengthen internal controls at the Department of Education to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future.
But it sounds unlikely that it sounds like they're unlikely to face sanctions from you or from state law enforcement.
On that issue, that's a federal issue that the Office of Inspector General will have to address.
I have a question. I want to make sure that I understand something. You said that you have the law authorizes you to recover misappropriated funds, and that would come from the Board of Education or from the individuals that receive contracts?
Depends on what the facts tell us.
Okay, so my follow-up question to that would be is if it comes from the Board of Education, are you not just taking funds from one state agency, and then if yours?
No, the
Okay.
Board of Education would be the board individually, the members of the board.
You mentioned MEMA earlier. What is the status of that demand from the federal government?
MEMA and DPS, the most recent, they actually invited us to come join them, to work with them, to review their finances, their audits, their expenditures and contracts, to help them in the negotiations with the federal government, with FEMA and with the Department of Justice. We have been involved in that, and in both situations, you've seen that dollar amount greatly reduced, and our staff has worked diligently with those two entities. I don't think we've got a conclusion yet, but I do think it's going to be very favorable towards the state of Mississippi at the end of the day.
So it won't be $30 million for MEMA?
No, it will not be $30 million. I do not expect it to be there.
What initially prompted the compliance audit? The auditor's office to do the compliance audit?
We've had significant findings the last 2 years during their financial audit. As you are aware, we conduct 2 primary audits of state government every year. The CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report on the state, of which MDE makes up the vast majority, almost 50% of our state budget, so they always are going to be included in that number and in that audit, as well as the single audit, all the federal dollars that come into Mississippi. Those are the 2 major audits that we conduct as a staff on state agencies. Both years, 2 years ago in FY, my years are running together, 15, FY15 we conducted that audit, and FY16 the audit was conducted by Clifton Larson CPA firm. They came in, they had significant findings as well. That led us to start the initial inquiry, and then the Department of Education had a press release, an announcement about the misspending of the 21st century money and the Title I money. We started requesting additional information on that. In light of the audits, we were given a press release. We were not giving financials. We were said, here's the press release we sent out this morning. That wasn't good enough. Again, it started raising a lot more questions, not only for us, but the U.S. Department of Education. So we'd already started the compliance audit, then all of that happened, and this became a issue in inquiry going in.
Have you found the department to be cooperative during the review?
In the documents that you've got in the reports, we've also added the amendment of some email traffic between our offices. I think that will help shed some light on that relationship. And I have said there's been a culture of obstruction. There have been roadblocks put in place consistently. It has not always been forthcoming. I saw the statement from the Department of Education this morning. I'll hope that is true, and as we move forward into this next phase, that they will be very forthcoming. As always, when we have these opportunities with the press or anyone else or public opportunities, to remind anybody in the public, but specifically employees of the Department of Education, if they do know facts to the misappropriation, mismanagement, or any illegal activity, 1-800-321-1275 is our number here at the office. They can call and talk directly to our investigators, or osa.ms.gov, go to our fraud tab and they can report. That's true to everybody in the public across Mississippi. People have asked in the past how many of our complaints actually come through those sources. About 50% of our cases actually come from tips and sources of that nature. Otherwise, thank you all so much for being out today. This is a big issue. It's the bulk of our budget. It's the most important aspect for the children, the next generation, for the students across Mississippi, our classroom teachers. We should all be raising awareness and be concerned. Our members of the legislature should have a very heightened awareness when they come back in January that they've got some real issues when it comes to the financial management, the Department of Education, making sure those controls, the administration, the state's Board of Education should be taking steps between now and then to strengthen their controls internally, to put good checks and balances in place to make sure they're complying with the law and cooperating with our investigators as we move forward. Thank you all again, and it's a privilege serving as a state auditor of Mississippi and getting to be a watchdog for the taxpayers. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Trying to beat the heat, sweetie.